Assalamualaikum and hello, my name is Kishana bint Uthman.
And my name is Nur Erika Balkis binti Muhammad Azmi. So today we are going to present to you
A condition that affects almost 68% of the world's population.
which is lactose intolerance.
So, what exactly is lactose intolerance? As we know, lactose is a major form of carbohydrate in milk. It is a disaccharide made up of one molecule of glucose and one molecule of galactose through the condensation reaction with the aid of lactase enzyme. In order to be absorbed into our small intestine, it must first be broken down into its monomer, which is a galactose and a glucose. So, in order to break down lactose into its monomer, lactase, which is a digestive enzyme, will play its role to catalyze the conversion of lactose into glucose and galactose. Thus, the deficiency of these enzymes will cause the inability to break down lactose into its monomer. This condition is what we call lactose intolerance.
What are their symptoms? When there is not enough lactase to digest the amount of lactose taken, the outcomes can be quite unpleasant. Even if they are not usually dangerous, symptoms occur because there is not enough lactase being produced by the body to digest the lactose consumed. The symptoms might be diarrhea, nausea, cramps, gas, bloating within 30 minutes to 2 hours after consuming milk or dairy products.
Moving on, we are going to look at the questions provided in our case study, which is the first question is, consider the word lactose free on both of the products label. Explain the reason for some customers who are selectively looking for food with lactose free label. So, by conducting our case study, we find that the reason for some customers who are selectively looking for lactose free label in their food is mainly because they are lactose intolerant, of course. As we stated earlier, lactose intolerance happens because the lack of lactase enzyme in their body, which this condition can cause a lot of health problems, which is diarrhea, abdominal pain, bloating, and so much more. So, in order to avoid those health problems, it is a smart way for lactose intolerant people to go and look for lactose-free labels in their food. Next question is, provide the metabolic pathway involved in this case. So as we can see here, people with normal lactose tolerance will end up digesting lactose in their small intestine, where the lactose is being broken down by lactase enzyme into its monomer, which is glucose and galactose. But it is a different case for people with lactose intolerance, which is when they ingest lactose, the lactose will eventually go to their small intestine, but the lactose will not be broken down into its monomer because of the lack of lactase enzyme. Instead, the free lactose will be fermented by colonic bacteria into short chain of fatty acid and hydrogen gas. This build-up of hydrogen gas is what will cause the bloating and abdominal pain.
How many people are affected or at risk for lactose intolerance? Lactose intolerance is very common, affecting up to 70% of people worldwide. The condition is very common among adults with Asian, African, or Native American heritage. About 30 million American adults have some degree of lactose intolerance by age 20. In African Americans, the problem can occur as early as age 2. In white people, lactose intolerance often develops in children older than age 5. It is less common in people of Northern or Western European background.
Moving on to question number 4 in our case study. The question asks, why will a test for tolerance to lactose measure the level of blood glucose and not lactose? So, the answer for this question mainly because to see the amount of glucose left in body after a person is given a drink containing a standard amount of lactose. According to data, normal blood glucose level tested while fasting for a non-diabetic person is between 3.5 and 7.1 mmol per liter. Therefore, if tested higher than the normal blood glucose level, it indicates that the person is either lactose intolerant or diabetic.
What role do mutations play in the evolution of new traits such as lactase persistence? Wait, what is lactase persistence? Lactase persistence is the ability of adults to digest the lactose in milk. And what's the differences between lactose intolerance and lactose persistence? Lactose intolerance is the result of being homozygous for the recessive lactase allele that is poorly expressed after early childhood. Being homozygous or heterozygous for the persistence allele allows lactase expression after the time when lactase expression is normally downregulated. Mutations in lactase persistence allow new proteins to bind to DNA or proteins to serve new functions. The role of mutations play in the evolution of new traits, such as lactase persistence, is when a new mutation or SNP is required to generate a new or increased persisting interaction with regulatory proteins to lead the trait. Mutations in genes are required to change protein function to acquire new traits. Here is the lactase persistence mutations. The European mutations is shown in yellow and the other mutations is red have been found primarily among African populations.
Question number 6. What role does the environment play in the evolution of new traits such as lactose persistence? So, based on our studies, we can say that the environment plays role in natural selection as one of the mechanisms of evolution of new traits, where organisms that are more adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on the genes that aided their success. This process causes species to change and diverge over time. Multiple studies indicate that the presence of two phenotypes, which is lactase persistent derived phenotype and lactase non-persistent, which what we call hypolactasia phenotype, are genetically programmed, and that lactase persistent is not necessarily conditioned by the consumption of lactose after suckling period. The lactase persistent phenotype involve high mRNA expression, high lactase activity, and thus the ability to digest lactose, while the lactase non-persistent phenotype involve low mRNA expression and low lactase activity. So, hypolactasia is known to be recessively and somally inherited, which means the individual with the non-persistent phenotype are homozygous and receive the two copies of low lactase activity allele from their parents who may be homozygous or at least heterozygous. But we found that only one high activity allele is required to be persistent. Lactase persistent behave as a dominant trait because half level of lactase activity are sufficient to show significant digestion of lactose. Furthermore, studies show that only 8 cases were found where the parents of a child with lactase persistent were both hypolactasic. So from this, we can come into a conclusion that if the frequency of lactase persistent phenotype is high in a population, or at least about 60% of a population, there's high possibility over a period of time there will be a population with 100% lactose persistent thanks to natural selection.
How can a mutation become more prevalent in certain populations? A natural result of mutation is that new forms develop, and these new forms may or may not add to the fitness of the individual. If the fitness of the individual leads to a reproductive advantage, then the alleles present in that individual will be more prevalent in the population. When mutations improve survival or reproduction, the process of natural selection will cause the mutation to become more common over time. When mutations are harmful, they become less common over time. Therefore, mutation is a force that helps drive evolution. When beneficial mutations are rare and selection is strong, positive selection results in a succession of selective sweeps. A mutation occurs, spreads through the population due to selection, and soon fades. Sometime later, another such event may occur. These are the process of mutations. First, an adaptive mutation for lactase persistence arises in a population. Then, through positive selection, after many generations, mutation becomes common in the population. Lastly, after many more generations, recombination breaks up homozygous regions.
So, from this case study, we can conclude that lactose intolerance is quite common in our worldwide population. Also, we get to learn a lot more deeper about enzyme lactase and how it affects our body. Last but not least, we also get to know a lot more about DNA mutation and how it affects worldwide population on lactose intolerance. That ends our group's presentation.
We are highly motivated owing to Mr. Azam
Teach us with exceptional professionalism.